Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Imperfect Podcast. I'm your host, Kirsten Pfeiffer, and I am here today with Jenna Overbaugh, who is a licensed therapist specializing in OCD, anxiety, and postpartum. Anyone that's listened to my podcast before, I've been very open with my journey with OCD, so I'm excited to dive into that today with you, Jenna. She's also the host of All the Hard Things podcast, and she works to educate and empower individuals to navigate through their anxiety and OCD. Jenna, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the wonderful intro. That is exactly what I do and hope to do anyway. So thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Actually, one of my previous guests, if anybody has listened to any other episodes, it was Megan Johnson. And I think that she's the one that recommended me to you just because she follows you. She's a therapist, and she said that you post really great educational content about OCD and anxiety. And since we were talking about mental health with Megan, and I just shared part of my journey, and my mental health journey was being diagnosed with OCD from a young age and kind of being forced into therapy at that age, but now like taking that intentional journey myself. So I'm really excited that she told me about you, and just even more excited and grateful that you were willing to come on.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just so cool how it happens. Like I had a mom today, no joke. She was struggling with postpartum OCD, said that she found me from someone else who found me from someone else. And because of something that I posted on Instagram, she was able to tell her doctor that she's not crazy, that she's not actually going to harm her child, that she actually has harm intrusive thoughts, which is very characteristic of OCD. And it's just weird how this like social media platform, which I used to hate, by the way, like has the potential to turn into something so educational and so informative and really life-changing for people. So it's really fun, and I'm happy that people dig it. So
yeah, well, it's just like anything else. Like anything can be used for good or bad. Like it's all neutral. Money can be used for good or bad. And I almost said anxiety. Anxiety does have benefits.
It can be, right?
It can
anxiety,
be, yeah.
Right? Like if we weren't anxious, and that can be definitely something that we delve into, if we weren't anxious, if we didn't have the propensity to be anxious, we would all be dead, right? Like we would just jump in. We would just, we wouldn't look 2 times before we cross the street. We wouldn't practice driving before we, have a driver's test. We wouldn't study before an exam. We wouldn't prepare before a job interview. We would all be donezo. So, and of course, anyone listening, and I'm sure you know too, anxiety can also be used in really detrimental ways, and it can be really impairing. So I think that was maybe a mistake on your part, but it's totally legit. Anxiety can 100% be used for good or for bad.
Yeah. Well, I actually read, I think someone posted it on Instagram. What I meant to say was social media can be used for good or bad. But someone posted on Instagram, and this is an example of using it for good. But they posted a study that people that reported low levels of anxiety throughout their lives were likely to pass away sooner from preventable things. So like,
there you go.
If you have anxiety about your health, like, oh, this isn't feeling right, like, let me go get it checked out. If you're someone that's just like cool as a cucumber always and like, oh, it'll be fine, you could have prevented some kind of disease. So I think it is. I love that I made that mistake and said anxiety, because it is a point that I wanted to get in today, that anxiety's there it can be used for good if we learn how to channel it. And so I'm excited to dive into that today with you.
Yeah, I have the perfect little, it's called the Yerkes-Dodson curve, or the Yerkes-Dodson Law. And it's kind of the relationship between anxiety and performance. And it's called it's a law now, essentially, because it's so consistent across so many different areas. And that's basically at really, really low or absent levels of anxiety, our performance is terrible. At really high levels of anxiety, our performance is terrible. But at kind of that sweet middle range, we tend to have the best performance. So I can talk more about that later too.
Yeah, I have a lot of follow-up questions for that. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, I would love if you could just tell people a little bit more about you and like what led you to this work.
Yeah, so I've always been an anxious person, and I am now. I've always had kind of like anxious energy. I remember when I was little, I would do really strange things. Like I always had to do things in threes because I was afraid if I didn't, then one of the Hanson brothers would die. And a lot of people out there probably, like, if they're too young, they probably don't know who I'm talking about, but they're the best band ever. And, you know, I did all these, like, really weird, superstitious things. I always thought, like, if my handwriting is pretty today, then I'm going to have a good day. And if it's bad or if it's ugly, I'm going to have a bad day. I was always just really socially anxious. Before school, I would get really nauseous. But regardless of all of those things, I always, even from a super early age, like kindergarten, I remember being like, no, I don't like feeling this way. I don't like this. Even back then, it kind of felt like a separate entity. Like it wasn't me. It wasn't who I knew I wanted to be. So even as a really young child, I was like, no, I'm not listening to that. I don't like doing that. So I'm just going to do the opposite and kind of like fake it till I make it. And so I would intentionally do things 2 times. I would intentionally go to school and like pretend and like go up to people and say hi and, you know, all these things that was the opposite of what my anxiety wanted me to do. And so I just thought that that was me. I just thought that that was what you needed to do. And, you know, it was just going to be my life and everyone did it that way. And then when I went to college in my Psych 101 course, I somehow, which it truly is very serendipitous because I don't even know that they traditionally talk about ERP or OCD or anxiety disorders at a Psych 101 level. But I heard about exposure and response prevention, which is essentially that, right? Like it's the gold standard treatment for OCD and anxiety. And in a nutshell, it is that. It's doing the opposite of what your anxiety or what your OCD wants you to do. If something tells you to do things 3 times, you have to do it 2 times. If you're anxious to go to school, you go to school and you go hard and you pretend like you love it. And no one else loves school or is more excited for school than you. And I was like, I have to do this. I have to do this. And it was just donezo from there. So that was back in 2008. And ever since then, I just like every internship possibility, every research opportunity, every faculty member who I could get them interested in OCD or anxiety work, I just did that as much as I possibly could. And then when I was able to specialize a little bit more, I went to grad school specifically for a program that was really known for its OCD treatment and research. And the day that I was supposed to walk for my graduation, I actually started at the world-renowned, it's a residential OCD and recovery center. It's a residential center where people go and they kind of live there for 45 or 60 days. It's one of 2 or 3 in the entire world. And it was just really well known. And I was there for the past 10 years. Got so much experience and learned so much about the OCD and anxiety population, working with the most debilitated anxiety individuals in the world. And now I'm at NoCD, which is a mobile teletherapy platform. We provide online, accessible, evidence-based treatments to people who have OCD and anxiety and related conditions. And it's just absolutely incredible. So I love it. I love every minute of it.
That's amazing. Well, first of all, you were such a perceptive and astute kid to like have that perspective. I mean, that was not my case at all. I was like, I internalized it so much, but obviously like when you internalize those things, and you let it fester, there's then like an external manifestation. So for me, it was really manifested in my schoolwork. Like in 5th grade, I was staying up till 2 a.m., like redoing my homework again and again, which like, I don't even know how I had that much homework to do that. But it was for me, like the perfectionist is really how my OCD manifested. But internally, I was having those thoughts like I have to do things in 3s, or I remember I thought, you know, that saying, like, if you step on a crack, yep, like you break your mom's back or whatever. Like I thought that if I stepped on a sidewalk crack, that my mom would get hurt. And
you would be responsible for that, right? And like that over sense of responsibility is really scary, especially for a child.
Exactly. And so I remember being so angry at my parents when they sent me to a therapist when I was in 5th grade because they just knew something was off. They didn't know what it was. I ended up being diagnosed with OCD. Because at that time, I think especially therapy was really stigmatized, especially where I grew up. And now I'm like grateful to have access to therapy, and it's a maturity thing too, obviously, but I am grateful for like the foundational things I learned during that time and applied it. My joke is I told my parents, I tricked the therapist into thinking I was fine because I just wanted to get out as soon as possible. But my parents were like, did you notice you got better though? And like I looked back and I was like, oh, actually, yeah, because it's almost that like fake it till you make it. I was like, okay, I gotta say whatever they want me to say to like kind of let me go. But I did take a lot of those things with me. And then it wasn't until recently when my roommate that I recently started living with, she opened up about her journey with OCD and that she was diagnosed when she was an adult. And so a lot of these things that I had gotten used to my way of thinking, I didn't even realize that they were attributed with my OCD because I hadn't really explored it that much in my adult years. And so now going back on this journey, it's just been so liberating because I think a lot of times anxiety or mental health issues leave us in this place of feeling powerless if we are not sharing it with other people. And that's why even the exposure and response therapy, where you're facing whatever the fear is or the anxiety is, it takes a lot of the power away. So that's a little bit about my journey. I just wanted to lay that groundwork for anyone listening that's not familiar with my story. But and then coming across your page, I think there's a lot being shared about anxiety these days, but not necessarily OCD. And I think that there's a misunderstanding of what OCD is because a lot of times it gets portrayed, especially in movies, as like a caricature of that. And so I would love if you could kind of just lay out like what OCD actually is.
Yeah, and I think you're so right. I think that not that media portrayal is incorrect, it's just a drop in the bucket of what actually could be. And so I definitely work with people who are terrified of germs and contamination and who, need to have things arranged in a certain way or just have to do things or they count even. But it's truly such a drop in the bucket, even if it is portrayed accurately. So a lot of times in society or in ads, especially, like I've seen so many ads who have had the best intentions, but they were just so significantly misinformed about the condition. And I think the OCD community has been really tactful and really effective in their approach at trying to advocate for what OCD actually is. And in some of those cases, we've been able to actually have really big brands, take down their uninformed ads and all of that stuff. But what OCD is really two things. We have obsessions and then we have compulsions. And that's, those terms might go over people's heads when they are actually experiencing them. So obsessions can be intrusive thoughts, ideas, images, impulses, or feelings. And so let's water that down even more. They're basically distressing things or experiences that kind of come into your brain or into your awareness just kind of out of nowhere. A couple hours ago, actually, I knew I had brushed my teeth. I knew if not just once, potentially twice. So I knew I had brushed my teeth, but as I was getting ready for the day, I had this intrusive thought that maybe I didn't actually brush my teeth. And that's just an example of kind of this like strange thought that comes in out of our awareness, kind of out of nowhere. And that's not necessarily super distressing to me. Of course, it could be to somebody. But the reality is that we all have these intrusive thoughts. We all have kind of weird thoughts that don't 100% make sense. And sometimes they are just strange. Sometimes they're harmful in nature. So like that you're, angry, someone's driving really slowly and you just want to get out of your car and snap their neck, right? Sometimes it's sexual in nature. So sometimes, especially with new parents, we get a lot of reports of parents who feel absolutely terrible, but that they especially dads, changing their daughter's diaper for the first time or being alone and giving their daughter a bath. They start to feel uncomfortable, like touching their baby in their private areas. They might have sexual intrusive thoughts like, oh my gosh, did I look at that a little bit too long? Or did I look at her down there a little bit too long? What does that mean about me? And there's really no limit to what an intrusive thought could be. Like what I could go over tons and tons of examples and still miss some. But some other common ones have to do with contamination or things just not being right. Could be, needing to count or do things a certain number of times. Could be about moral issues. Could be about scrupulosity. Could be about relationships, could be about sexual orientation. We're seeing so many kind of new themes, as we call them, or new little subtypes. But the reality is that if it meets the check boxes, and even if it's not kind of in these traditional subtypes that we typically see, it could still be obsessive and compulsive, right? So an obsession really boils down to something that's intrusive, it's distressing, it's coming in out of your awareness, kind of out of your control. And the most important piece here is that it's ego dystonic, right? So ego dystonic means that it's inconsistent with your values. That causes you some anxiety, a lot of discomfort. And when we tend to misinterpret those experiences as being significant somehow, like you had said, right? Oh my gosh, I just had the thought that I could, if I stepped on that crack, then I'd break my mom's back. I'm sure many of us have had that thought from time to time. The reality is that so many of us can kind of let that thought come and let that thought go and, keep doing whatever it was that we were doing. But when you have OCD and when you have a brain that's hardwired for wanting certainty and you're very averse to these experiences, you take responsibility for these thoughts. You want all of your thoughts to be perfect. You want to control your thoughts. You tend to maybe even have some thought action fusion, like, oh my gosh, I had that thought, so now somehow that makes it more likely to happen, and now that's really going to be my fault. And so because of that anxiety experience of all the significance we're putting on these thoughts versus just being able to kind of let it come and let it go, like other people who don't have OCD, we feel the need to do something about it. We feel the need to do some type of safety behavior, feel the need to do some type of anxiety reduction strategy. And that is usually an OCD called a compulsion or a ritual. But it really could be a whole array of things. Could be distraction, could be avoidance, could be thought stopping. Don't think about that. Don't think about that. Other compulsions might be just like hand washing, counting, reassurance seeking from others. Googling online has been a really big one lately with all the information available online kind of at our fingertips, just wanting to know. But a compulsion is anything. It could be behavioral, so something that kind of happens externally that you do outside of you, but it can also be mental. I think that's one of the big misinterpretations with OCD is that the compulsions have to be done externally. But the mental behaviors, the mental compulsions are just as debilitating, if not more so sometimes than the behavioral ones. So if you're having, these experiences that are intrusive, that are repetitive and disturbing to you, and you feel the need to have to negate that anxiety somehow or alleviate that anxiety somehow, and you're doing that in a repetitive function that feels impairing and really distressful to you, then that could certainly be diagnosed potentially as obsessive compulsive disorder.
Right. And is OCD like you have it or you don't, or can it be on a spectrum? Because I feel like whether someone has OCD or not, I'm sure a lot of people can relate to some of the things that you're saying. So I'm just curious if that's something where it's like either you have it or you're not, or it can exist on a spectrum.
So many times I hear from people, because OCD is the doubt disorder. I usually hear so many times people, when they have just what I would call slam dunk cases of OCD, they're definitely debilitated by it, would be totally responsive to treatment. They sometimes will hide. They'll sometimes kind of be shameful or feel like they're not OCD enough. And it's like, no, if you feel like this is impairing your life, meaning it is taking away or inhibiting you in any capacity from living your life to your fullest potential as you see it, and if this is distressing for you, then you can potentially get that diagnosis, right? So with any diagnosis, we are looking for distress and impairment. So how much is this stressing you out? How much distress is this causing? We also look for that impairment. So we often will look at things like activities of daily living. So sleep, eating. We'll also look at relationships, your ability to function at work. And then one more kind of, I use it a little bit more loosely. Other professionals may be a little bit more stringent about it. But in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, it does say that one of the requirements to kind of meet OCD criteria is that it should take at least an hour of the day, whether that's with the obsessions and or the compulsions. But I would venture to say that anybody who's seeking out therapy, who is inhibited by in their life in some form or fashion by their OCD, they probably meet that criteria. Even when you take into account simple behaviors like avoidance, right? Avoidance is kind of the lack of doing something based in fear, but I would still qualify that under that 1 hour a day. So to answer your question, I do think that, yes, you either have it or you don't, but a lot of that is dictated by the person, right? Like, are you distressed by this condition? Are you feeling this impairment in your life? And how much time is it taking in your day?
Yeah. And so much of what you were saying about what some people's compulsions may be, or what's triggering the obsession, I was thinking about how much that must change, like, with the time. So for example, I've never been someone like super freaked out by germs, but the past year and a half with COVID, I find myself obsessing of like, did I wash my hands enough? Do I, like, all of that? And then I get in my head like, oh, my throat itches now. Like, you go down that rabbit hole. And so, and for me, I would say like my compulsions more so are like the ruminating thoughts and kind of like going down and trying to control that way. But have you seen with your clients like that there might be what they're experiencing, their OCD might be triggered by current events, or is it kind of individual according to each person?
100%. And in fact, we could expect, someone who kind of is a good OCD opponent, I would say, like a therapist, who kind of knows OCD's tricks and knows its own strategies. We can expect and we can anticipate that OCD is going to shift and shake every once in a while. That, if someone comes to me with harm intrusive thoughts, we can work on that. And I'm also going to need to work on some other things too, because it's not just superficially about harm thoughts or these harm-related obsessions and compulsions. It's about doubt, like I said. So there's a lot of research to suggest and a lot of, just clinical experiences to kind of substantiate this idea. Dr. Reed Wilson is actually really amazing at educating people on this. He's kind of pioneered this concept that these themes that we talk about, contamination OCD, just right OCD, perfectionism, moral scrupulosity OCD, I like the subtypes. I think that they help connect people. I think that people identify with those things and find solidarity in that label, and I don't ever want to get rid of them. With that said, I do think that sometimes people who really identify with that, like how you had said that for the most part you had been struggling with perfectionism, so on and so forth, they then feel like that's the culprit, right? Like that it's only going to come out in that form. And so they don't necessarily have their armor up or their skills ready for it to play this whack-a-mole game, which it often can do. So many times people who have OCD really refer to it as like a whack-a-mole game. Like I work on the perfectionism and then the contamination comes up and okay, all of a sudden COVID is taken care of, or I got my vaccine or whatever. And now I'm worried about my relationship. And there's really a couple explanations for that. So we tend to find that OCD latches on to what you value, right? So for the longest time, my obsessive compulsive tendencies tended to be in one form or a couple different forms, maybe more so related to school, just like you, because I was in grad school and because I was like a new professional in the field. And that was really important to me. Just I was mentally reviewing conversations, didn't want other people to see me anxious. As an anxiety therapist, I felt like that was taboo and strange. And so that was always anxiety provoking for me. But then I had my son, right? So I had my son 3.5 years ago, and that sparked a ton of postpartum issues. I had harm intrusive thoughts. I had sexual intrusive thoughts, thoughts that I would just have left him at the grocery store, even though he's sitting on my lap right in front of me. And I knew that that was crazy. So OCD will definitely shake and shift depending on what it is that you value, including the current events just of the world, kind of whatever it is that's of the most importance. But my big takeaway for people regarding this particular specified topic is that OCD is not necessarily about your superficial subtype or subtypes. So if you're someone who's really struggling with relationship OCD, or if you're really struggling with sexual orientation OCD, that's kind of the superficial manifestation that it created for you to fluster your feathers based on your values and the time of your life right now. It's all about uncertainty. It's all about doubt. And so it's about the fact that we have brains that don't tolerate doubt, that don't tolerate uncertainty. And so if we can get to that in treatment, if we can do exposures around that and sit with the true fact of life, which is that there's uncertainty all around us and we don't know anything and we have far less control over things than we actually thought that we did. If we can actually open ourselves up to that potential versus maybe I left my son at the grocery store, maybe I didn't. We're getting to the root cause of OCD. We're getting to the root difficulty. And that's how you stop the whack-a-mole game.
Right. That's so powerful, especially because like when I reflect on times where I'm feeling like really unhealthy in my anxiety or OCD, it really comes from the place that like something out of my control has happened that my brain is identifying as bad. And then I double down like I could have prevented this from happening. Like I need to control this more. I need to be better. And so kind of in the heart of making this applicable to everyone listening, whether they have OCD or not, I think probably a lot of people can relate to that like we all want to avoid pain, right? Like we all want to avoid bad things from happening. But at the end of the day, if the pandemic showed us anything, no matter how hard we try, like there's bad things are going to happen that are out of our control. Like nothing could have prepared us for that. And so I think the more that you can like lean into the doubt and the uncomfortable feelings, that's where you can find true freedom. And that's what I've found. And so that's why ERP is so powerful for OCD. I know we've been talking a lot about ERP in this context already, but I would love if you could just kind of explain more about what that is and how maybe people can apply that to their everyday lives, whether they have OCD or not.
You're so right. And I think that that's one of the reasons why I love exposure and response prevention. I do not think that these skills are skills that are solely meant for people who have OCD, right? Like we are a world, we are a community of individuals. And I don't know why, that's not my expertise, but you're right. Like we are averse to anxiety. We are averse to uncomfortable experiences. We have a sense of urgency, a lot of us, whether you have OCD or not, we have a sense of urgency to get rid of negative emotions and to get rid of negative, uncomfortable experiences. And the reality is that just makes everything so much worse. And, you know, whether you have OCD or not, learning the tools and the principles behind exposure and response prevention could help everybody. I always say that we should be teaching kids this in school. We should be teaching this as part of like normal self-care. And so exposure and response prevention, otherwise known as ERP, is this concept of kind of in order to get over it, you have to go through it. And, you know, we think of OCD as being a two-part problem that, you know, therefore needs a two-part solution. So OCD having obsessions and compulsions, we really need a two-part solution, which is going to be the exposure piece and then the response or ritual prevention piece. So exposures are simply things that are challenging, you know, things that you would otherwise not want to do. Based on my previous examples that I gave in the beginning of the show here, that would be things like doing something 2 times instead of 3, doing something 1 time instead of 3 times, going to school when I felt anxious about it, saying hi to someone who I've never seen before. When I was really struggling with postpartum OCD, I had a lot of intrusive thoughts that when I was dressing my son, if my husband wasn't there, like monitoring or supervising, that I would just lose control of my impulses and I would snap his ankle. And it was like this feeling like, and this image, and it was just horrific. And so I myself had to do exposures where I dressed him, and I started out with pants because his legs were a little bit stronger and less fragile than his little ankles, right? I did exposures where I had to independently, when my husband wasn't there, I had to put socks on him. And so the exposure piece is really important because we need to teach our brains, again, whether you have OCD or not, and this is for all types of anxiety, by the way. So social anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, phobias, anything that makes you anxious. If you are anxious, even if you don't have a diagnosis, even if it's not impairing your life this much, you can benefit from doing exposure therapy, quote unquote exposure therapy, right? Even if you just do it yourself. So exposures are anything where you're triggered, where you would normally want to run and hide, but we're going to have you kind of offensively go in the direction of that thing. What's important is that you also need to not do these rituals or these compulsions or these anxiety reduction strategies that normally you would otherwise do to try to make yourself feel better in that situation. So, for instance, it wouldn't do me very much good to have put my socks on my son, or it wouldn't have done me very much good to put socks on my son when my husband was right there, because my husband being there was a reassuring factor for me. So my husband being there was the avoidance and the anxiety reduction strategy. So I had to eliminate him from the piece of the puzzle, right? So that required me to put the socks on my son, feel anxious about it, and I had to keep doing that. I had to do that 5 or 6 times a day for like a week until it no longer bothered me anymore. And so, you really have to identify, what are the things that trigger me? What are the things that I do to deal with or to cope through these triggers, whether it's distraction, whether it's thought stopping, hand washing, counting, reassurance, rumination, like you had said, which is kind of this more general term for just mentally reviewing or mentally engaging or analyzing anything. A lot of times people ruminate and they're trying to figure something out, but actually it's not effective. Research shows that it makes us more depressed, it makes us more anxious, it makes us more uncertain and less confident in our problem-solving abilities. And just as an aside, for anyone out there who's listening, I don't think there's functionally much of a difference between worry and rumination. Dr. Michael Greenberg does a lot of great work in this area, and he has kind of pioneered, this concept of how to handle rumination and OCD. So I would encourage anyone out there to definitely seek out those resources, Dr. Michael Greenberg. And so we want people to do a couple of things or to learn a couple of things from exposure therapy. And there are a couple reasons why it's the, gold standard treatment for OCD and anxiety. The 2 models that really underlie exposure therapy are 1, the habituation model, and then 2, the inhibitory learning model. Oh my gosh, I could go on for days, but first and foremost, the habituation model is this idea of you do something, you get used to it. You do something, you get used to it. You do something, you get used to it. You kind of get bored. It's essentially like if you were to watch a scary movie one time, it's really scary and you don't know what's happening. But then if you were to watch it 250 times, it would be the most boring movie in the world. And so we essentially need you all to watch all the scary movies 250 times or whatever it is that exposure might be for you in that example. The second model that really kind of explains why ERP is so significant and so helpful for people is the inhibitory learning model, which basically says that, this is going to be a mouthful, but I'll try to go slow, that we basically need to replace old threat expectations with new corrective learning. So watering that down, that means we need to put ourselves in these new and anxiety-provoking situations. We anticipate threat. We anticipate that something bad is going to happen. We're like, threat, bad. We sit through that. We challenge ourselves. We don't do the avoidance or the anxiety reduction strategy that we're used to. And we actually learn that the world spins on and all the bad things that we thought were going to happen actually didn't happen. And that creates new learning. And so our brain tries to incorporate all that together and basically whether we're conscious of it or not, our brains become less interpreting of threat in that situation for the next time. And so there are a lot of things that we like for people to learn or hope that people learn with exposure therapy. One, that anxiety is uncomfortable. It's not dangerous. So you can feel uncomfortable. You can be in a pure panic state, and that's uncomfortable, but it's not dangerous. Two, we want you to learn that your feared outcome is not as catastrophic as you think. That by putting socks on your baby, that at worst you might, make him cry or make him uncomfortable if you were maybe a little distracted or rough, but chances are you're probably not going to snap his ankles from that. The third thing is that we want people to learn that their feared event isn't as probable as they think. So with OCD and anxiety, we tend to overestimate the probability of something bad or horrific happening. We tend to assume that I'm 99% sure I'm going to fail that exam, when in reality it's like maybe 2%. We don't know what it is, of course. That's part of the whole game. But we also want them to know that these rituals that they were doing, this avoidance, it was never necessary in the first place, and it never actually kept them safe. They have to deal with the uncertainty just like everyone else in the world. I have to deal with the uncertainty. You have to deal with the uncertainty. Jane Doe has to deal with the uncertainty. We're all scared. We're all just rolling the dice. And those rituals actually didn't keep you safe, didn't make you special, didn't do anything except make it worse. So it's really great. It's scary, but we can make it challenging but manageable. It's very collaborative. Sometimes people are very scared to get started, like, oh my gosh, that sounds so backwards, and it totally does. But I would also argue that anything backwards from OCD it's got to be better than OCD, right?
Right. Well, and I love the analogy that you used about watching a scary movie a bunch of times. And like kind of what came to mind for me is like a dark room. It seems really scary, really dark. But the moment you've just put even one light on, it gets so much brighter. And it's like the more lights that you can put on these things that are festering, the more that you realize the dark, scary room is actually not scary. You just need to shine some light on it. And so I think that like no matter what it is, if you have OCD or not, there's these like dark, scary things that we sometimes don't want to go towards, whether it be like conflict in relationships or something. But I found anytime I've like had to have a difficult conversation with someone, just addressing it and putting light on it, automatically I feel better. And kind of in that same vein, you've talked about relationship OCD a lot. I actually don't really know what that is, and I'm just curious because I think relationships is something that a lot of people can relate to. What is that?
Mm-hmm. So relationship OCD is something that obviously has been experienced for years, forever. So anytime that we kind of get this new subtype or that we hear more about the subtype, it's not that it was never experienced before. It's just that I think people are just talking about it more and we're getting more research behind it. And, as one person speaks up and says that this is what they're dealing with, suddenly everyone else comes out of the woodworking and says, oh my gosh, me too. And so do that enough times and suddenly we have this new subtype, right? But that's another reason, referencing our conversation from before, that's why I love subtypes, but it's also why I don't, because how many other people are we missing just because we haven't talked about it yet, right? So anyway, when we talk about relationship OCD, we're talking about OCD around relationships. So, and that can come out in so many different forms. So the examples that I give are definitely not inclusive. If anything that we're saying fits what you're experiencing, that's amazing. But just because it doesn't mean that, you may not have OCD or whatever. So, relationship OCD is just that. It's obsessions about your relationship. It's compulsions about your relationship. And it can be any relationship that you value, right? I've never had anyone come to me and say that they have OCD about this person from 25 years ago and they're so irrelevant that they can't remember their name, right? It's always going to be about what you care about, who you care about, all those things. So normally it's with our partner, our romantic relationships, but it could certainly be with your baby. It could be with a parent. It can be with anybody. And so a lot of the obsessions that we see in quote unquote relationship OCD would be things like, do I love my partner enough? You know, I had this feeling of attraction towards this other person. What does that mean about me? That must mean that I'm not in love with my partner the way that I thought that I was. So on and so forth. So I was working with someone who her partner of 10 plus years, she clearly loved him very much. They were a great couple, and he forgot, I don't know, to contribute to some work gift or something, and it was just the end of the world for her. That, oh my gosh, he forgot to contribute $5 to this gift. That means that he's selfish, and that means this, and how did I not see this coming? And it's, again, another example of how we all have these thoughts, right? We all have thoughts that don't make sense every once in a while. We all have thoughts that are a little bit strange, or quote unquote crazy, or quote unquote not normal, whatever that actually means. But really in OCD, it's the misinterpretation of those things somehow. I had that thought, that must mean something. I have to fix that. I can't just let it go and move on. I have to perseverate on that. I have to figure it out. And then they'll do compulsions about it. So, a lot of times they will, research online, so many quizzes like how to know that your partner is the one for you, and a lot of reassurance seeking. So a lot of confessing with their partner, I just want you to know that I thought that guy from the other day was a little bit attractive. I feel like I need to tell you 100% of everything so that you know who you're with. So yeah, it's always been experienced more than likely, but people are talking about it more, and we're doing some more research on it. So
yeah, well, even you mentioning the fact that there's more research being done because people are sharing their experiences is something that they are struggling with. I think that is so powerful because no matter what we're going through, I'm such a big advocate of just being real and vulnerable and honest for two things. One, getting back to that analogy of shining the light in the darkness, the moment that you just open up, this is something I'm going through, it stops you from like internalizing that shame, A, and then B, it allows other people to feel vulnerable of like, oh my gosh, like I'm going through that too, or I might not be going through that, but I'm struggling with this other thing that I feel shame about. And that doesn't mean we go around and tell everybody like our laundry list of things we're going through, but it's amazing how it impacts interpersonal relationships in creating that connection. Brene Brown talks about all the time how vulnerability connects us, but also just from like a scientific research perspective, hearing that how that's pushing the field forward is like really amazing.
100%. And the example that comes to mind with this, although it's applicable across all the subtypes or whatever people are struggling with for sure, is postpartum issues, right? So I think especially like new moms, new parents, we have this toxic positivity attitude about parenthood, and it's like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Do we hide our own issues because of toxic positivity, or is it because of toxic positivity we had our issues? And I think that they kind of both play off of each other, unfortunately, which creates a really nasty environment for new parents. And so I think a lot of new parents, I want to say moms, but it affects dads too. It affects other caregivers. It affects adoptive parents. And yeah, it's just definitely one of those scenarios because of the environment that's very particular and toxic and overly positive, in my opinion, about parenthood, that you have to enjoy it all the time. Aren't you just loving every single moment? And it's like, no, I'm not. I am having intrusive thoughts about like, I feel like I'm so sleep deprived that I'm going to like throw my baby off the balcony tonight if he wakes up one more time. No, I'm not enjoying every moment of it. And like you said, obviously we don't need to go around and share our deepest, darkest secrets with people. But for instance, the other day, I think it can be really powerfully done and really tactfully done just in really subtle ways. And I think that if we add this up and we all do it, it can create really powerful change. So the other day we had a new neighbor and her kiddos came over to play with my little toddler, Eli. And she was asking, we were just getting to know each other. It was our first time chatting. And she asked me, she had 2 little boys, and she asked me if Eli was our only one. And I said, yeah, I had a lot of postpartum issues. You know, I didn't take to motherhood really well. It just made me, you know, really anxious. I had some OCD stuff going on when I first had him. So we've decided that he's going to be our only one. And she was totally receptive of that. She was supportive of that, didn't pry, didn't say anything offensive or judgmental, which is great. Can't promise that that won't ever happen. But who knows what happened in that moment, you know? Like maybe she was struggling, and so now maybe she feels comfortable coming to me later with that, right? Who knows, right? And so, you know, maybe a lot of moms or new parents aren't in that position, or people with anxiety or OCD in general aren't in that position. They're not in that part of their recovery where they can just say that and be that confident or courageous about it, and that's fine. But I think it can be as powerful as just that. Like, no, he's our only one. I really struggled when I was a new mom. I had some anxiety and OCD issues. So we've just decided we're not going back there.
Yeah, and that's so courageous too, because it's like, it would be a lot easier probably for you to be like, yeah, like I'm the perfect mom, you know, and not have to go there, because it does cost you something too to be vulnerable and to put that out there. But I think if nothing else, that just created a space where, like, if she's going through something, like, you are that safe place if she needs to talk to you. But at the very least, knowing that, like, if she was feeling insecure about something in her life that day, I just think people, my pastor says this all the time, but people relate a lot more to our weaknesses than our strengths. And especially with like social media, where we like to put our highlight reel on there, I think that people are tired of seeing like that polished, perfect version. And so, like you said so beautifully, like the more that we can have those subtle moments of realness with one another, I think that will create like lasting change within our society.
Yeah, 100%. And I guess my hope for anyone with OCD, anxiety, whatever it is that we've got going on, is that you can get to the point in your recovery where you feel firm and you feel confident and you feel courageous with where you're at, that you do feel able to just say that little statement if you want to, right? Like if it is aligned with your values. And obviously advocacy and helping other moms, that's part of my values. And so that was like my own little values work in that moment. So I guess my hope is that everyone can get to that point in their journey where, you know, we don't have to love our anxiety. We don't have to love our OCD or really be grateful for it. I don't know that that's ever a possibility. But I do think that we can get to the part where we can use it for good and we can really rein it in. And like you said, like we had talked about earlier, right? Like using this in a functional way. Like, what can I do? How can I harness this experience? And, you know, I declare independence from it. Like, I run the show. What can I do with this now?
Absolutely. It's like full circle. I was going to say that too. We were talking about this in the beginning, that like anything can be used for good, I believe. And as you said, it's not like we're like, yes, I'm so glad I have this anxiety. You know, like I don't want to be unsensitive to anyone really going through that, because as we've both shared, we have experienced that as well. So like, I know how debilitating that can be. One like final question here, because you mentioned it earlier and I'm really curious. Is it it's the Dobson-Hobbs model? Is that what it's called? Or am I butchering it?
The Yerkes-Dodson. I love this. It's one of my favorite things to teach people about. And I think so many people are going to love this. So, and it'll make total sense. Like everyone's light bulbs are about to go off right now. So there is something called the Yerkes-Dodson curve. And like I mentioned earlier, it's kind of called like the Yerkes-Dodson law now, just because it's been so consistently evidenced across so many different situations and scenarios. So if you look it up, if you literally Google it, you'll be able to see a lot of great graphics and depictions visually of this experience. So if you could imagine just a bar graph or just a graph and an x-axis and a y-axis, I have to remember my X's and my Y's, going up and down,
That's
up and
why.
down.
Why?
There we go. So it's the relationship basically between anxiety and performance is what we're really looking at here. So performance could be anything. It's not just performance in, you know, a job or performance in an exam. It could be performance on a date. It could be performance at motherhood. It could be performance literally at anything, at doing an exposure, literally anything. And then we have its relationship with anxiety, also synonymous with pressure or arousal. So just like how stressed you are in that situation. So it basically follows a pretty predictable like bell curve. And so at really low levels of anxiety, we have low levels of performance. And so if we, going back to our conversation from before, if we have no anxiety over something, we're not going to perform well. If I'm not anxious about a job interview, I'm not going to do well in that job interview. I'm not going to have researched the company. I'm not going to have thought about in advance all the questions that they're going to ask me and go through functionally like how to answer those in a constructive fashion. An example that I give often is in high school, I took a woodworking class and it was like 1/10 of my GPA. And no, even if I failed that class, it literally would not have dropped my GPA any significant amount. So I didn't care at all. I had no anxiety over that class at all. I had no anxiety. Fail me. I don't care. Just fail me. I'm not anxious. The worst case scenario could happen and I don't care. My performance in that class was absolutely terrible because I wasn't anxious about it. I didn't care. And so on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have really, really high levels of anxiety. We're freaking out, right? Like this is the most important job interview ever. And we just can't sleep about it, right? Like we're researching the company, trying to memorize all these things. We're freaking out. We're overly prepared. We become exhausted. We avoid the job interview. Maybe you don't sleep that night, and so your mental abilities aren't as sharp as they would have been. Think about any exam that you're really, really stressed out for, right? You maybe avoid studying for it. You postpone it. You put it off. And so when you're really, really high levels of anxiety, you're also just really burnt out. You're irritable. You're tired. You're frustrated. You just avoid. And so you also have really, really low performance. Example of this was in grad school, I had to take a statistics class. And I had to work so hard in that class because it just didn't come easily to me. But it was also like if I didn't pass this class and I didn't pass this specific exam, I was going to have to take it all over again and like stay an extra semester. And I don't think I started studying for that exam until like the day before because I was just so anxious about it, right? Somehow I ended up passing, but my performance probably wasn't as good as it could have been had I just lightened up a little bit. The idea, though, is that the sweet spot is in the middle. We want a little bit of anxiety. We want enough anxiety to care and to kind of light a fire under our butts. And we want to be motivated. We want to be conscious. We want to be, receptive to new information and have our listening ears on. We want to be, careful to some degree because this is something that we value, something that we care about. But we don't want to have so much anxiety that we're kind of going on to the opposite end of the spectrum. And so if you are on either one of those spectrums, right, if you're not in that sweet spot in the middle where you have the highest performance potential, if you're too anxious and you're like that burnout stage, you're avoiding things, we need to lower your arousal, right? We need to lower that stress. Whether that is, making a timeline for how you're studying, whether that is reducing noise, or, going to the library to study versus, trying to study around a bunch of different distractions. So trying to find some way, like what can you do to reduce your anxiety about the situation to literally move you from super, super high anxiety to a little bit lower, anxiety so that you can be in the middle. And then at the other end of the spectrum, if you're not anxious enough about something, we kind of need you to get more skin in the game, whatever that means. So like applying some rewards, applying some consequences to something, and that's totally dependent on your own unique situation and kind of what it is that your performance is about. But that visual representation, I would encourage everyone to kind of look it up and see because it applies to everything. It applies to so much. And the takeaway for that is it's not good to have no anxiety. That's not the goal. Anxiety is our friend. Anxiety keeps us alive. And you can be anxious and still perform really, really well. You just have to make sure that you're harnessing it and kind of using it in the right way.
Right. I mean, it's so helpful to think about it in that way. And I love those like practical ways that you can kind of try to find that center balanced place. And it's hilarious because as you were talking and giving your examples, it made me think of, I'm an actress, and it's kind of a running joke around a lot of actors. It's like the jobs that you really don't care about are usually the ones that you book because...
And that's why.
Yeah, because like, and it's interesting to think about it from an acting perspective. It's like why you do it is because in acting, in order to perform well, literally perform well, you have to be in a relaxed state where you can like authentically react in the moment, in the scene. If you're so anxious, you're going to be in your head, you're going to be stiff, the camera's going to pick that up. And so whether you're an actor or not, like anytime we really want to do well in something, if you put too much pressure on it, you strangle it, and you need to kind of like find a way to, and for me, like that anxiety doesn't ever go away when I start acting, but I find a way to get present in the moment, and all of a sudden that anxiety channels into energy that I'm using and emotion I'm using in the scene. And so thinking about it in that perspective, whether you're an actor or not, like how can you find something to get grounded in whatever you're experiencing? Whether it be, okay, I'm going to chunk out my study schedule, I'm going to break this down into things, and then using that anxiety, channeling it as your energy and your motivation for good. So I think that's super, super helpful.
Yeah, perfect example. Perfect example.
Yeah, and so, okay, we talked about a lot today. I've loved every second of it. If you could leave any listeners with anything, what would it be?
Oh my gosh, I literally just got chills. Like I have goosebumps because I just got washed with like a million different ideas. My piece of advice would be, and this is slightly tailored from something that Dr. Reed Wilson has said before. If you can't tell, he's like my professional crush. I just love him. He's so wonderful, has a great YouTube, has so many great anxiety and OCD resources to his name online. So definitely check him out. But Dr. Reed Wilson says that you have to have courage first, and then comfort follows that. So what that means is you're not going to be able to be confident before you go and do something, right? Like before a really big acting, position, you're not going to be necessarily confident, especially if it's like your first one or two. You have to be courageous. And the definition of courageous is to be scared and do it anyway. And I think so many times our bodies, and I see why, right? Like I'm, like I said, by definition, almost an anxious person. I feel the physiological effects of anxiety every day, multiple times a day. I get that it's uncomfortable, and your brain and your body are literally telling you threat, go, run the other way. You have to treat this like a mental game. And I think that's why you called me perceptive. And that's a great compliment. But I think it's because I'm actually just really freaking competitive. Like from a very early age, I've always been very competitive with my anxiety. And I think that's kind of what we have to do. So whether this is related to OCD or someone out there is just struggling with anxiety, and again, it doesn't have to be a disorder. It can be the fact that you're really just anxious about a date, or really anxious about an exam, or really anxious about a job interview or something. Try to not let your body, when you feel that feeling of threat, like you get really scared, try not to necessarily go down the threat aisle, right? Like it's a mental game. Try to, do what you can to try to be courageous, be scared, and do the thing anyway. Don't wait for yourself to feel confident. Don't wait for yourself to not feel scared. Do not wait for X, Y, and Z to happen before you act. It's okay to feel scared. Do the thing anyway. I hear so many times people, when I tell them like ideas for exposures, or I tell them encouragement to do this or that, well, it just feels so wrong. It feels so scary. And I'm like, okay, like you have to do it. You have to do it. You're not going to feel less scared before you do it. You have to do it. It's going to be scary. And then there's so much waiting for you on the other side. So do not wait to not be scared before you do something.
Well, now I have the chills because I think it's like, yeah, like we have to get competitive with it. It's like we literally have so much joy and freedom on the other side of those things, and we owe it to ourselves to like claim that and to not just like let the anxiety win and not just like fear wants us to stay small. And like how many people can you impact, not just yourself, if you take that first step and you're competitive with it and you're courageous. So I love that. And you said something else before too that I wanted to highlight again. It's in order to overcome it, you have to go through it. And it kind of, is that it, or am I butchering it?
Yeah, in order to get over it, you have to go through it. And so you're bringing to mind a metaphor that I often use to really demonstrate the benefits of exposure and response prevention and mostly inhibitory learning. But really, imagine if you were afraid of dogs. Let's say that you were bit by a dog when you were little, and so you had this kind of threat expectancy that dogs equal bad, dogs equal threat. And doesn't matter if dogs aren't your spiel or your fear, just insert whatever it is that you're fearful of and it'll fit you. Let's say that you're walking down the street and someone is walking their dog, right? You have this threat expectancy. Dogs equal bad, dogs equal threat. That dog is going to bite me. Let's say that you walk on the other side of the street, right? You avoid that dog. That's your kind of quote unquote compulsion or your ritual or your avoidant reduction strategy. That's your avoidance or your anxiety reduction strategy. Consciously or not, you just had the experience of telling your brain, whew, good thing you got away from that dog because otherwise you would have gotten bit. And it's like, maybe we can't promise that would or would not have happened, but what else are you missing out on, right? Like, let's say that you could rewind and you did walk by that dog. Yes, that dog could have bit you. I don't know that, and I can't promise you that. And that dog could have been super chill and super sweet, and he could have licked you, and he could have been super nice, and really just like, you know, like most dogs are. He also could have been totally neutral and not given a crap, right? And so by doing these anxiety reduction strategies, we are only ever giving in to the learning that our worst fear is going to happen, or that worst fear was going to happen regardless of what else we could have done. But in reality, like, we're robbing ourselves of learning all these other cool things. We're robbing ourselves of the ability to learn, like, oh my gosh, that dog was so cool, or that was totally anticlimactic, right? And that's so powerful, like, to think about all the other things that you could be learning, to think about all the other life experiences that could be waiting for you out there if you just didn't default to your anxious voice.
And by the way, you used the perfect example because I was attacked by a dog when I was a baby. I did avoid dogs my entire childhood until my grandparents got an amazing Irish setter who healed me, I swear. But I was forced to be exposed to that, and I loved her. I wrote letters to Gabi when she died. Like, I just like, but like that to say, like, I would have missed out. That was such a cherished memory from my childhood, my relationship with that dog, and I would have missed out on it if I wasn't being forced to be exposed to it.
And the other important thing to mention is that, and this is the perfect example that you just gave, because you couldn't have learned that by logicking your way into it. You couldn't have learned that by just challenging your thoughts or just, going to talk therapy about it, right? Like, at some point you had to challenge the behavioral avoidance of, you have to be exposed to this dog.
Yeah, exactly. And that's
the mechanism of change.
Yeah. And I think that is like, as we are moving forward in all of this, I think that's like the biggest takeaway that I'm going to take away from this. It's like, because scary things are going to come up always. Our world is a really scary place. Like right now, more than ever, we can see that. But the more that we can lean into facing our fears, being courageous, and being real with one another and know that we're all going through things, I think that that's where we can really start to see some change. So
I was just going to say, I think that that's a really great takeaway, too, that there's something called the downward arrow technique, and your listeners are going to either love me or hate me because I'm giving them like a million things to like go and Google and do more research on. But there's something called the downward arrow technique, and we use it a lot in therapy to basically identify a core fear, right? So let's say that someone is afraid of, I don't know, of not completing all their homework. Okay, so we would do the downward arrow technique and we would identify, okay, well then what? Let's say that you didn't do all of your homework. Let's just say that today you didn't get to all your homework, then what? Well, then I would go to school and I wouldn't have my homework done. Okay, then what? And then what? And then what? And then what? And then what? Okay, well, let's say that happened. What would that mean about you as a person? What would that mean for you? And suddenly it's not about homework anymore. It's about getting in trouble, or it's about being embarrassed, or, being shunned, or having your family be disappointed in you. And it transforms, then you get to what we call the core fear. And Dr. Michael Greenberg and other professionals would also say in anxiety and OCD treatment, it's really important to get to the core fear. Because again, as I've mentioned previously, it's not usually about these superficial manifestations. There are deeper things here, and we need to challenge those things. And so if we figure out the core fear, we'll get to be able to do exposures around that, around disappointment, around getting in trouble. So now we're not just working on homework anymore, right? We're working on the deeper stuff. And I bring up core fears because of what you said, which is that we all have them. We all have these core fears. My husband, who is the most unflappable person in the entire world, has core fears. I have core fears. You have core fears. Maybe they're all a little bit different. It's just with OCD and anxiety, these behaviors come in and they're like, da-da-da, everyone has to live with this. But somehow if you do this behavior, if you just seek reassurance from your partner a million times, or if you wash your hands, somehow you'll be safe. And it's like, no, no, we're not safe. No one is safe 100% from COVID. But, anxiety will come in and say, what if you wash your hands, and if you if you wipe down every single grocery, even though that's not in the CDC guidelines anymore, somehow you'll be safe. And it's like, no, you could still get it. We all have to deal with that.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up too, because I didn't know that's what it was called, but I often do that myself. And I wasn't sure if that was helpful or hurtful. It's literally just something that I'm because part of how my brain is wired is I like to logically think through things. And that can be harmful sometimes because I overthink things. I've realized, just like anything we've been talking about, it could be used for good too. I'm like, okay, well, let's go down the path of what actually will happen if I forget to order this thing, or, whatever it is. And it gets to that core thing. And when you can uncover that, then you can work towards, what lies am I believing about myself that I need to try to control the situation, because it all comes back to control. And that's been a super helpful technique for me, and I'm grateful that you shared that, because I think that anyone listening, whether they have OCD or not, just kind of taking a step back instead of letting yourself get sucked into the spiral of the worst thing ever is going to happen from this. We realize, I think you said this earlier, but the world will keep on spinning. I'm going to be all right. And yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. We've talked about so many good things.
I know. I'm we literally can keep going. We might have to do a part 2 at some point, because
I'm always down for part 2.
Yeah. But you also have such amazing resources. So I kind of want to leave it here and let people check out all the amazing work that you do, because it's helped me so much. Where can people find you?
So thank you so much. I forget. I have so much fun just putting out education and information and playing around with colors and artsy stuff. I forget that it actually helps people. So that's really sweet that you say that. So I live mostly on Instagram. I'm at Jenna.Overbaugh. And like I said, I work at No CD right now. So it's a great community. If you have resonated with anything in this episode, it's a great community to come and learn more. So whether you work on it or not, whether you sign up for therapy or not, obviously we offer those services. But we also have a really great in-app community. It's kind of like a social media kind of thing. We post encouragement, we post tips, we post tons of different things. You'll get to connect with other people who have thoughts just like you. We offer free support groups. You do not need to be involved in therapy services at all or have a formal diagnosis. If you just kind of feel like this resonates with you and you want to learn more, come on over and check out our free support groups. We have lots of free educational webinars. If you really enjoyed learning about this, there's so much more waiting for you. Just go ahead and you can download our free No CD app on the marketplace. And like I said, we do offer therapy services, but we're ready when you are. So I also, as you mentioned, I have a podcast. It's called All the Hard Things. And so I go really in depth there about nerdy OCD topics and other things. I have a whole episode related to the Yerkes-Dodson curve that we talked about here and other things. So if you want to learn more about OCD, anxiety, about exposure and response prevention, that is an excellent resource and a really great way to have me kind of in your ear talking at length about these wonderful, wonderful topics.
Well, you are amazing, Jenna. Thank you so much for just sharing all of your excellent expertise and wisdom with us today.
Oh, well, thank you so much. You had so many great examples, and yes, if you ever want a part 2, I am more than happy.
Yes, I would love that. And thank you everyone so much for listening. I'll see you next week.